you so much for coming out tonight. I'm Suzanne Sparge. I'm the Executive Director of 516 Arts, and I'm so excited to see you all. What a nice crowd and amazing group of people. I see a lot of familiar faces in our New Mexico art world, and it's really exciting when we can come together like this. So thanks for being here. I'm going to make some opening comments, but I first want to turn the mic over to Rachel Pablo. Rachel is our curator, and she is going to give a land acknowledgement. So thanks, Rachel.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Rachel Pablo. I am from the Dene Nation. I am from the Red Running Born. I'm so sorry. I'm so nervous. Red Running Into the Water, Born for When the Water Comes Together plant. And the land acknowledgement, I'd like to acknowledge this is the Tiwa territory and of the Northern Pueblo. And I'm really nervous. I don't know why. But Albuquerque is currently built on the ancestral homelands of the 19 Puebloan nations that was also shared with the Mescalero and Chiricahua Apache nations, the Utes, and later the Nene. Their respective ancestors, those living today and the unborn, this land always has been, is currently, and will always be for the winged, fit, and four-legged. We are acknowledging these sacred living waters and rivers that cross this land. Finally, the sun, the moon, and all the stars and planets that keep our systems in balance. And these are the words of Roger Frawa, one of our advisory board members of 516 Arts. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. I'd just like to make a few quick announcements before we move on to tonight's program. 516 Arts has 2 new staff members. I'd like to introduce April Chale is our new deputy director. And J.C. Gonzalez is our program and marketing manager. So welcome, you guys. We also have some other folks involved in 516 who are here tonight. Board member Rebecca Black is here. Stand up, please. Hello. And there may be others, but I just want to say thanks to everybody involved. So this exhibition, 12 New Mexico Artists to Know Now, is produced by Southwest Contemporary every year, and we're really honored to host it at 516 Arts this year and collaborate with Lauren and Southwest Contemporary. Lauren Tresp is going to be moderating tonight's panel and introducing all of the panelists. I'm so happy you're here. And I just want to say a quick thank you to our funders, the Ford Foundation, the Henry Luce Foundation, the City of Albuquerque, Albuquerque Community Foundation, New Mexico Arts, P&M, and Bank of America. So thank you to them, and also to the Clyde Hotel and Heritage Hotels and Resorts for lodging our special guests. And if you don't already know, 516 Arts is a independent nonprofit organization, and you can become a member and support what we do here and receive benefits. So there's membership brochures up there, and if you're not a member, please consider joining up or at least signing up on our mailing list so you hear about what's coming up. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Lauren Tresp and all of our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for the introduction, and Rachel for the land acknowledgement. As Suzanne said, I'm Lauren Tresp. I'm the editor and publisher of Southwest Contemporary magazine and co-curator of this year's 12 New Mexico Artists to Know Now. This is the 5th year of this show. If you're not familiar with Southwest Contemporary, we are primarily a regional arts publication. We publish in print and online, covering 6 states across the Southwest region, sometimes beyond, sometimes even into the borderlands and into northern Mexico. So we are engaged in a regional project of looking at, thinking about, talking about, writing about contemporary arts. But this project, the 12 New Mexico Artists, is our way of surveying contemporary art in New Mexico and really looking at the artists through an open call that we do every year that is juried by arts leaders across the state. So we're celebrating these artists, we're reflecting on and looking at what these artists are thinking about, what they are concerned with, and how those ideas and topics and questions reflect our own topics and questions as a community. So, why are we here on this panel? And I have thought a lot in preparing for moderating about why I'm here in this room with you tonight. And I would just invite you all to take a second and think about why you are here. This panel is called In Context, New Mexico in the Art World. So maybe you were drawn to the topic, maybe you were drawn to the show or to one of the panelists up here. Maybe you're a part of the 516 Arts community. There's a lot of different reasons why you might have come tonight. And I just invite you to reflect on that, and hopefully that will be guiding when we get to the open Q&A. We're going to leave a lot of time to talk about the ideas that come up tonight. So the idea of the panel is to take the premise of the show, to consider New Mexico artists, and to blow that up and think about New Mexico art as an economy, as a community, as an art world, and we'll get to what that might mean. And I'm so honored and grateful to have this incredible panel of speakers that you're going to hear from on these ideas. So I will, without further ado, introduce our panelists, starting with Louis Grachos. Louis is a contemporary art museum director and curator who has dedicated 35 plus years to a museum career collaborating with contemporary artists in all media to develop exhibitions and programs that realize artists' visions. He is currently the Phillips Executive Director at Site Santa Fe, returning to this role after serving as Site's first Director-Curator from 1996 to 2003, an interesting path to and away and back to New Mexico. He's also served as the Director of the formerly the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, 2003 to 2012, Director of the Contemporary Austin, 2012 to 2019, and the Palm Springs Art Museum from 2019 to 2021. Jadira Gurule is the Head Curator and Visual Arts Program Manager for the Art Museum at the National Hispanic Cultural Center here in Albuquerque. She finished her BA in Art History at the University of New Mexico in 2010 and her MA in American Studies at UNM in 2015. Her curatorial work engages themes of race, gender, pop culture, social justice, and the role of museums in building community and shaping national discourse. Marie Mithlo is a Chiricahua Apache curator, writer, and professor. Her exhibitions have been shown at the Venice Biennale from 1999 to 2017. Mithlo has worked as the chair of the American Indian Studies at the Autry National Center Institute and as a professor of gender studies and American Indian Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is the author and editor of several books about Native Americans and Indigenous art. And last but not least, Marina Perez is a descendant of the Nahua and Huichol peoples of West Mexico. She is an interdisciplinary scholar, educator, cultural worker, specializing in community and cultural art making processes. She earned her MA in American Indian Studies at UCLA and is currently a Ph.D. student in art history at UNM. Her scholarship addresses emerging themes in contemporary Native arts, archives, and oral histories. So I'm grateful to have such an incredible panel with varying experiences, and I just want to start by getting a little more context from each of you. Can you talk in brief about how your work has intersected with contemporary arts, specifically in the state of New Mexico?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me tonight. I, as was mentioned, work at the Art Museum at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. So we work with contemporary artists from across the world, actually, but paying particular attention to those who identify as Hispanic, Latinx, Chicano, Chicana in New Mexico.
I'm Louis Grachos, and I came to New Mexico to be the the first director of Site Santa Fe in 1996. It was right after the first international biennial that the organization put together. And it was such a great opportunity because I learned very quickly how rich and deep the cultural community and the artistic community was in New Mexico. And the ability to be able to start programming, continuing the recently started tradition of the International Biennial. And it really brought my attention to the importance of really understanding my context in New Mexico in relationship to the goals and missions of Site Santa Fe, was to really create an intersection of artists that are working anywhere and everywhere with our community. And the richness and the depth of what I discovered in those early years has stuck with me. And I've been working with artists that live and work in New Mexico that are involved in our programming. There were many artists from New Mexico that were brought into the international biennials. We've done 11 of them. I was there for 4 of them. And it was a really a wonderful discovery for me, New Mexico. I knew a little bit of the superficial history, and I'm learning also and continually learning about the richness of this community. And I'm happy to say that I'm seeing a new generation of artists that are really emerging and showing and exhibiting, and so it's yet another opportunity to work with our team at Site Santa Fe and really developing a strong rapport and presenting some of the great artists that are working here.
Hi everyone, this is so great. Let me just start by saying thank you to 516 Arts. I'm so fortunate to have a long relationship with this institution and specifically with Suzanne. And thank you for all the opportunities that you've given to so many artists through the years. Suzanne and I were reminiscing this afternoon, and I curated a show here with a group in 2013, Airland and Seed, and so it's great being back. Thank you to the audience, thank you to my fellow panelists. I would start by saying this is my homeland. The Chiricahua Apaches, we were compensated under the Indian Claims Commission for all of southern Arizona and New Mexico, and we are a state-recognized tribe. So I'm here because I belong here, and also I'm here because of the Institute of American Indian Arts, and I can't say enough good things about that institution. If you don't know about it, just hop online and look at it. The Museum of Contemporary Native Arts is a fabulous place. I was a director there for a hot second. I mean, really just like a 6-month interim period. And I know how hard that job is. So I want to give a shout out to Patsy Phillips, the director of that institution. And I also want to give a shout out to one of my prior students, Marcella Ernest, who is here in the audience with us. He's an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico, Department of Art and History. And Marina is Marcella's student. And so thank you 516 for including Marina. So I have my grand student here next to me. And we are actively crafting something that's wild and wonderful. So thank you for being a part of it.
Hello. I just want to thank 516 Arts, the panelists, Lauren, thank you for including me in this conversation. So I'm actually really new to New Mexico. I recently relocated last year to start my Ph.D. program with Dr. Marcella Ernest, who's the daughter student of Dr. Mithlo. And it's kind of funny because, throughout my time in Los Angeles, I met a lot of artists in different places that have really strong roots in New Mexico. So, wanting to study in contemporary indigenous art, it just made sense for me to come to this place, because really it's the place to be. So, thank you.
Thank you all so much. So I want to go back to the title of this panel, which is, as I said, In Context, New Mexico in the Art World. And my first question is, what is this art world that we speak of? We throw this term around, all of us, myself included, as this very vague concept. We kind of know what it means, but do we really have a common definition for it? So I'd like to start from a place of kind of defining and problematizing what is the art world. So I'd like to hear from each of you, like, what do you think we're talking about when we talk about the art world?
Anybody else want to go? I'll do it again, but not the whole time. I first want to thank you for this question. I think it's a great question because a lot of times we get really comfortable using language that we forget to think about the specificity of what it means. And I think the danger of that sometimes is then also we make assumptions about what people mean when they're using that language, and that can go wrong in a lot of ways. So I'm thinking about this, I think for me when we talk about the art world, it's all of these intersecting things, art market, art economy, it is the communities that create it, artists that create it, it's publications that write about it, it's museums that show it, galleries, kind of everything that's intersecting and touching on that, for me, is what I think I'm thinking of when I say art world, is sort of like the really big orbiting thing around that. And then certainly more specificity around things like market, and I think like community in particular feels like something that's a little bit more intimate to me, and revolves around more like a shared set of values, or at least maybe similar experiences, similar place, that type of thing. But art world, I think, kind of like holds the giant discourse that we're all functioning in, from my perspective.
It's a great question, and one of the great things about this place is that it's a real ecosystem of an incredible depth of talent and artists, and creativity runs not just in the visual arts, it's in performing arts, and in terms of writers, poets. It has the complexity of a really complicated past and cultural sort of fusion, and I think makes it an attractive place for creative people to really work and produce. And so on many levels, I think the ecosystem is a little unbalanced in that, given the talent we have here, whether they're young emerging artists or artists that are late in their creative lives, the sustainability of that is really difficult here because we don't have that driving market that can really support the artists. So the institutions take an important role in presenting, supporting, and really, in many ways, can be a real conduit to following an artist's aspirations and supporting them. But I think it's unusual as an art world in that, given our population and the number of the creative life here is really second to none. I mean, we can't compare ourselves, and we shouldn't, to New York or other large art centers, but given the intersection and the intellectual curiosity that exists here is really what attracts a lot of people here, whether they're artists, collectors, curators, and I think that confluence has existed for a long time, and it ebbs and flows in terms of interests during times, but like for example, right now we're experiencing an incredible interest from the outside world of what's happening, and that's driven a lot by the artists that are starting to really get invited to participate in large-scale exhibitions globally, which is really exciting. But it's also a place that I found to be really unique, in that there are artists that really don't show outside of New Mexico that are really critical to the discourse, and their practice has a real impact on the artists that live and work here. So it's this incredible balance of artists that some will go on and really show everywhere, others really have long and important careers and contribute in different ways here in New Mexico. So this balance is really interesting. And it's one of the things that really attracts me to wanting to be here, wanting to work with artists, and the accessibility, the mobility of communication amongst, again, all artists in all practices is really unique. Not to mention the great physical beauty of New Mexico, which attracts a lot of people.
Well, yes to everything that's been said, and I wrote down intellectual curiosity. I'm going to hold that. So full disclosure for me, I confessed this to Suzanne earlier, but I've been an educator for 35 years, and COVID was not a fun ride for any of us. For those of us who are professors at universities, we're all suffering from burnout right now. We're just like barely kind of creaking in the door, standing up in front of students and doing our job right now. So when I heard this question, I had to get a little sassy about it, and I'm sorry, but you know, for me, art world connotes something that's outside of us, that we really were arguing with, and we don't like it. I mean, usually it is used in the negative fashion, right? You know, that's the art world. Oh, damn that art world, you know? It's never like a wonderful, embracive, warm thing. It's usually like something that you're not, and maybe you want in. You know, I just want to throw that dynamic out there, you know. So it does stand for institutions, and it stands for power, and it stands for commerce, and there's a lot wrong with that. And I find myself here, you know, I'm writing a book now, I'm on sabbatical, I'm going to be in a better mood a year from now, just check with me, and a year from now. But, you know, right now, I'm not only like non-institutional, I'm anti-institutional. You know, I just think that we need to outgrow a lot of the systems that we've normalized, that are pathological, unhealthy, you know, they're built upon unsustainable systems. And I just think the sooner we get to that conversation, the better. So, anyway.
Yeah, so I think I was presented with like two challenges mentally, right? Like, should I go the celebratory path, or should I continue on with Dr. Mithlo's kind of critique? And I think really it's like, yeah, I think my instinct is to say that the art world is a colonial construct, right? To even think that we need to construct a completely different world away from our everyday lives. And I constantly think how like we live and we act and we embody art in different ways. And you know, thinking about the art world again as like an institution, I come from a place where I'm constantly working with young people, with, you know, communities of color that don't have access to be able to enter the art world, where our knowledges are not necessarily, you know, embraced or acknowledged. So I kind of, you know, I struggle with this concept of the art world, and it kind of feels like we have to walk, you know, this binary, you know, what is fine art and what is community arts. The binary of what is contemporary and what is ancient, right? Consistently. So yeah, I'm just kind of thinking through some of those concepts.
Thank you. And this is exactly what I hoped would come out of this question. And I have to thank Nancy for providing me with this question. Actually, our preliminary conversation really helped me think about how bizarre of an event title we had landed on, and how problematic it is. And I'm so grateful for both of you to give voice to that critique. I'm also grateful to hear about, you know, the other perspective of the community perspective, which is also important, and in New Mexico really does feel very coherent and welcoming, and like people do belong. So with that tension in mind, I want to move on to New Mexico, and again, this is a problematic question perhaps, but is often seen as a state, the Southwest as a region, really much of the country, which I would call sort of the intercoastal art market or art communities, everywhere beyond New York and Los Angeles. We're sort of seen as removed or lesser than or somewhat provincial in our cultural world or our artistic world. Is that perception grounded in any kind of reality? Why or why not? How do we deal with and confront and push back against those kinds of characterizations? You're first again.
I crack under pressure.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing if you're going to go first, because in our preliminary conversation, we spoke about just the logistics of being in a place that is geographically far, and working across the state of New Mexico involves travel, and there's some logistics and realities to our location as well.
Yeah, I think I was talking about an experience visiting with some artists in Las Cruces, and I think sometimes we talk about New Mexico like it's one thing, but depending on the regions in New Mexico that you're in, there's very different identifications with terminology and experience, and always good to have those reminders. But I am hesitant to say like a yes or no solidly about whether or not that's grounded in reality, but I think it's definitely grounded in a history where, you know, New Mexico has like a really long history of people sort of like coming into it through layers of colonialism, romanticizing, you know, the people who were here first. And the art market was incredibly steeped in that, and it literally was a market. Like, people were coming in and being like, hey, brown people, you should make this, and sell it. And of course that's happening in a colonial context, so there's all of these things that are being lost at that time also, so people are having to do other things to make living, and it's a really complicated thing, but that's, but that kind of being the ability to romanticize New Mexico and imagine it as somewhere like elsewhere, like you're escaping modernity, you know, kind of in the early 1900s, I think that kind of stuff continues to this day, and but the reality is like even then and now, there's always been artists who are connected across the globe. Always been artists from New Mexico who are showing, and the fact that people are coming here, right, like also demonstrates that we're part, and I think you mentioned this in our conversation. It demonstrates that New Mexico isn't as disconnected as sometimes we like to think it is. So I don't know. I think it's complicated, but definitely steeped in a really problematic history to imagine that New Mexico is somehow like disconnected or quaint or out of step with time. Those are narratives that have been built over time and are super dangerous.
Explain to people I didn't live in Mexico, but in New Mexico. So it's I think the romanticizing of our state is, there's no question that happens, and it's created some distortions. The concept of the marketplace, Indian market, for example, last year, and I think even this year is going to be even more populated with people and visitors that are you know, participating. So it is something that my perspective is that actually there's a lot of respect for New Mexico in terms of, you know, the history. People are attracted to coming here. Yes, some of them romantically, you know, the great physical beauty of our state, the isolation, you know, the context of, you know, a very complex past really plays a role in that. And I think one of the things, asking artists like those who have moved here to work and live in New Mexico, really enjoy this sort of ability to completely isolate and really, you know, work in a very tight vacuum. And for some, that's important for the creative process. And then there's, you know, this is what I meant by intellectual curiosity. Then when you need stimulation through other artists, through intersecting with other people that are in the different disciplines and the traditions, then there's a richness that can happen there. So I think there's, it's something that's certainly in the last century and a half is what have drawn outsiders to come here and live here. And many of them learn to love it and become part of the fabric. But I think there's growing interest, and I think from my time, and I have a little perspective in that I was here many years ago and I came back recently. So it really, there is this kind of legitimate interest in what this place is, whether it's, you know, for the wrong reasons or really sincere reasons. It depends on the individual, obviously, but it really is something that continues to attract, and it is a mecca for creativity.
Yeah, good conversations. I think when I was presented with this question, I thought less about space and I thought more about time. And so the story that came to mind is my mother-in-law, who lived to be 106 in Santa Fe, Ana Maria Hauser Gallegos y Chavez. from Abacu, and I went to a centennial dinner. It must have been in Santa Fe, like at the convention center or something. And I realized that Anne was the same age as the state of New Mexico. And she was sitting next to me. She always liked her glass of wine, and you know, she was getting her photo taken, photo op, you know. And just fully present and involved in that moment. And I think that's hard for people today to kind of think about how close all of this is. And I kind of like shrinking time, and Anne was able to do that because she actually grew up in what we think of as Georgia O'Keeffe's home. But Anne lived there before Georgia O'Keeffe and was still living after Georgia O'Keeffe. And it just kind of all puts it into perspective, right? You know, that these histories we think are far, and none of them are far. And so the thing about whether we count or don't count, I mean, I think we all count, and there's a lot going on elsewhere, but I don't know that that needs to bother us. I don't know, I have the luxury again, I'm in the classroom. I'm not doing necessarily the shows in the institutions right now, so I think it's a different perspective, but yeah.
I always love your stories. Yeah, so I think I do struggle a little bit with this concept of isolation. I think it's really grounded in settler colonial logic, right? This construction of the myth that New Mexico is somehow removed completely from communities, from art ecosystems, and that's not to say that even like rural communities have like real concerns and issues, right? But I think it's also this idea of like we need to start reframing or rethinking the ways that we talk about the art market here in New Mexico because it's very localized. And I think in that way, it is, you know, building off of this legacy that the other panelists are discussing. So yeah, just kind of, yeah.
Thank you. So we tackled the title of this event. We talked about New Mexico. We talked about the art world. And what I've learned from our preliminary conversations and would like to continue to learn from all of you is how connected things really are. But what I've found and find in my own work, working with artists and working with arts professionals, is that so much of that connective tissue in the arts is happening out of sight of the public eye, where the public comes and sees this gallery exhibition. They're not really seeing all of the relationships and community building that it took to get this put together. So I'd like to hear from each of you, like in your own work, and coming from different angles and different approaches, like how are you facilitating that work of creating relationships, creating community that you think people aren't necessarily aware of? Maybe we should start down there, to be fair.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start off with, so one obvious kind of connection for me is, as a Ph.D. student in art history at UNM, a lot of my peers are MFA students. The majority of my classmates are MFA students, and I've been able to really learn about the art scene here through them. And then one of those networks that came out of that was something that my advisor, Dr. Ernest, created. She organized collective constructs, which I'm sorry, I should probably back up. So collective constructs consist of 4 members, Marcella and I, and 2 of my MFA students, Frances Reynolds and Anna Roddy. And together we helped organize a portion of the show called Hindsight Insight 2.0 at the UNM Art Museum. And that was a really good experience just to learn about the institutional process of also building networks within, academia, but also within the institution. Yeah, so.
Glad you gave that some notice. So I'm just going to have to keep on with the storytelling. So I have a home in southern New Mexico in Tularosa, and I've had it for 15 years. Actually, when my tribe started gaming, I felt kind of conflicted about it, and so I thought, I'm just going to put it into this house, and this will be a family house. So Our tribe was separated in 1913 when we were released as prisoners of war after 28 years of being basically political prisoners indefinitely detained. I mean, this sounds weird, but I just have to tell you, it's like recent history and all this is real. And so the Mescaleros are here in New Mexico, but the rest of the tribe is in Oklahoma. And so I thought, I'll have this house, and the Oklahoma people will have a place to stay. And it's actually working out just great. And so every year I do crazy stuff in the yard. I was pouring concrete this summer, that kind of thing. But how I created community just recently, and I haven't told Marina this story, but I got hit by a truck. I mean, I was in a bigger truck, okay, just to make this really clear. I was in the bigger truck. The smaller truck hit me, okay? It was in the middle of I-54, if you know Tularosa, 54 and 70. And I was like a block from my home. They always say this happens, and it's so true. It's a block from my home. And I kind of went into shock. I was hyperventilating. You know, we had EMTs. There were 16 emergency vehicles there, which I was very impressed by. 16, and there was like the hot shots, the fire crew, they were all there. And, you know, Tularosa is a place that I only spend a few months in, if I'm lucky. If I have a full year, I can spend a full year there. But I've tried to make inroads, and I have relatives, and, you know, I kind of got to know the whole neighborhood. There's a lot of elderly people there, too. So the word went out in the village that Nancy was struck by a truck. And it wasn't bad, guys. It's just like whiplash. I mean, but I did the whole thing. The emergency room, I did the whole thing. I'm trying not to take the muscle relaxer tonight, just so I can be very coherent with you. But I created community. I did, because a lot of people that I knew didn't know each other. And once I got hit by the truck and the whole village knew, everyone started talking to each other. I mean, people that live across the street. They're cooking me enchiladas. It's just like, it's an amazing thing. So I don't know what that has to do with the arts, except it's a southern New Mexico story. Yeah.
That's funny. Well, you know, it's a really good question. Lauren and I talked about this for a while, and it's also hard to explain because it's based on a number of things. One is the culture you build, and you know, kind of this idea of what should an institution's role be in a community, right? So it's one of the things that, you know, you try and develop a culture around an organization like Site Santa Fe, where my team, myself, invest a lot in that role of putting people together, being a conduit, being, you know, leading relationships and trying to create connections is really an important part of the work. It's, you know, it's critical to how you think about yourself, and to be open, to be expansive, to give your team the opportunity to make connections in the most widespread spectrum of your community. And that's something it's hard to do. There's no formula, because it takes people power, it takes commitment, it takes time. And when those opportunities arise, you can start to make an impact in a community as an organization. So, you know, in my, I get in trouble with my team all the time, because sometimes I keep the door open and it causes issues. But on the other hand, it's really I mean, I hate to use the word, but it's about connecting people to the networks that they want to connect to. Every artist has different aspirations, and if we can help in making those things happen, inspire a young student, connect that student to somewhere that they want to be connected to, is an important role for an arts professional. I know Suzanne's been doing it for over, I don't know, 2 decades, right? And it's an important role that I don't think the community necessarily sees. Whether they appreciate it or not, I don't know, but it's something that we as a team actively work on. And it's a way that you know, we can connect a curator that's working in Los Angeles with an artist that's working in Milwaukee. And we listen to queries that we get from visiting collectors, curators, all arts professionals, and we try and make those connections happen. And the great thing about our team is we have a resource of people who have lived and grown up in New Mexico, and bringing that all together as a collective actually can make a real impact. And I've seen my team, and I'm very proud of many of them who've really made those kind of connections happen. So.
I think I agree with everybody. Part of, so coming from the museum perspective, I think the thread I'm kind of hearing is like helping people who don't know each other, and I think that's a responsibility certainly that we have, and I will just toss maybe the word mentorship into it, because I know that for me that was huge. I got to work with my mentor for so long, and she was not stingy with her contacts, which some people can be, and she was very much like, I'm going to take you to things, I'm going to introduce you to people, and that made a huge difference of just being willing to be like, hey, you're the next generation, I'm going to make sure you know what's up and get you connected. I also think, because I agree with the institutional skepticism, even though I'm here speaking on behalf of the institution, because there's a lot to be said about how we build trust with those connections, and I don't know that I or my institution does that perfectly all the time, but it's definitely something we're thinking about and trying to actively work on. And I'm also thinking about, this is all of these different thoughts came to mind, about the ways that we can create connectivity sort of that don't always require the connection of knowing a person, right? But I'm thinking about our digitization project that's coming up, and for so long how so many of these artworks are in collections at museums that you kind of got to know a person to know that it's there and do all of this research and archival stuff, and that's great and fun for some people if you like that stuff. But digitizing a collection, you suddenly can make all of this stuff really accessible, and then people can kind of reach out and we can go from there. And so I'm trying to think about connectivity from a variety of different standpoints and how we as a museum can just increase access and transparency about how we're doing it too.
I know there are artists in the audience and arts professionals as well, and speaking for myself, I sometimes feel like I'm outside of the art world, and I'm running an art magazine, so if I feel that way, I think other people feel that way. Do you have any advice for people in terms of cultivating these relationships, or when we're feeling disconnected, where to find those connections? Advice for cultivating relationships, cultivating that community, finding those connections when we're feeling disconnected.
I feel like I'm so introverted, I'm always how do we connect with people? I think again, from the museum perspective, particularly working with artists, reach out. I think that we're trying to do our part and go out and do things and meet people and stuff like that, but also I know it can be a little intimidating to reach out to the museum and just be like, hey, here's my work, you should know about me, or we should set up a call or a studio visit or whatever. I can't speak for all museum people, but I'm really into that, and that's my favorite part about my job. So I'd say maybe push through the fear, especially if you're an introvert like me, and take a leap and reach out.
I mean, it's all part of, we just went through a year of self-reflection, and what our mission was, what our role was, and the three principles that came out of those discussions were, first of all, we were committed, and our programmatic philosophy really was guided by artists. I mean, that was, which is no surprise for an organization that's focused on new art and presenting new art. And the other element that came down, and these are the challenges. Okay, so we're an institution guided by artists, and then and this became kind of a bigger discussion. So we're rooted in New Mexico, and what does that mean? And so we're exploring what that means. But the most interesting challenge is coming up is, what does it mean to be a trusted community partner? And that to me was okay, this makes sense, and this is how. I mean, I hardly think of SITE as a big institution, because we're very nimble, and kind of what you see is what you get when you walk through the doors and the galleries and the shows that are up, and likewise with 516. We don't have the backdrop of collections, and so it is, how do you become that gathering place where an artist feels comfortable asking honest questions. How do you become an institution that's so engaged in community that you're starting to see the connections that artists of your community are wanting to make? And those are exciting opportunities, and it's part of what I think museum culture, certainly worldwide, not just in the United States, needs to address. And there are a few leaders in that field. I just experienced that at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto that have really been pioneers in terms of how to present Indigenous work and Indigenous artists and how they committed to it. And it's an incredibly complex and thoughtful system because they go back to the principle of they're going to be guided by the artists of how they want their art presented in a museum context, which really breaks a lot of tradition. And I mean, I learned that as a really young curator when I had a very traditional director who, like, the art could only be touched by the registrar and the art handlers. And we were working with an artist who kind of didn't like what he was seeing with his sculpture, so he was told that he couldn't touch his work. And he couldn't move it. And he said, okay, well, tell the registrar to come and blah, blah, blah. And he waited and waited, and he just said, fuck you, it's my work, I'm gonna move it. And at that moment, I realized, like, why are we creating these constructs to an artist who's trying to exhibit their work? It was like such a ridiculous situation. And so it was a lesson for me. I mean, I love what he did. And no, he didn't wear gloves at all. And so it was really an eye-opener. But I think that's part of our role as cultural workers to really try to connect those people, those individuals, to create a culture of an exchange, an openness. And that's something that is not a formula. And it takes time, and it takes the kind of investment from not just the director, not just a curator, but everyone engaged in the organization.
So I love that we've reached the part of the evening where we're all telling stories, which I love. So back to the truck. No, really, what I learned, the part that I forgot to say is I had to ask for help. I'm not good at that. I am so bad at asking. I don't know about you guys. That's the last thing in the world I ever want to do, is ask for help. But, we're all human beings and we need help. So I'm thinking about this lesson in humility for myself. And I'm thinking that not only artists, asking for help, like I need a show, which is, I can understand why that would be, it would make you feel small, right? So I want to couch that by saying it's not a straight ask for help. It's an ask for help with a big dose of I deserve this. I deserve this, and I'm coming to you and I'm pretending to ask for help, but really, I deserve inclusion. I deserve inclusion. And then as you guys were talking, I was thinking, what would it be like if institutions asked for help? What if they were modest and human and said, and I know you have to do this when you do those fundraising things, in PR, it's time of year where we're asking for your help. That never really works, does it? Doesn't really work. But, if we could all think creatively about that, because the institutions deserve it. 516, Suzanne, you deserve it, right? Louis, you deserve it. All of us deserve, to have enough support in our lives. So it's a delicate dance, right? It's being modest, but it's also with an air of, I belong already, right? And if you don't do it for me, I'm still okay, But it would be cool if we could hang out more together. That's the kind of vibe I would put to it.
Yeah, I often think of, how in the art world, there is a culture of transactional interactions. So I think, building meaningful relationships and, using that as a way to navigate the world, I think is really important. And I guess just referencing the card story, often thinking about, like how we need people in all places, right? We all have skills and we all have techniques and knowledge to share, so we might need an intro lady one day. Yeah. We won't know it until that day comes. And I love this concept of mentorship too, but on the flip side, it's like also having a process of being a good mentee. So like understanding reciprocity, right? And like, again, like how you foster that relationship with your mentor, I think is really important. You're gonna have your own protocols with that mentor, and obviously it's gonna look different for each mentor. So yeah, I just kind of think through, ideas like that. So thank you for bringing up that mentorship, because the truth is that I wouldn't have been here without my mentor. So thank you.
I just flashed real quickly. I think all throughout COVID, Marina and I were on Zooms constantly. And it was helpful for both of us. It was like really mutual.
I'm going to turn now to a slightly different set of questions. Well, we'll see. We're going to leave time for Q&A, so if your minds are busy, save the questions. But first, New Mexico's so-called art world, and certainly its art market, are built on legacies of conquest, exploitation, and colonization, predating statehood, as has come up already today. And still, much of the art market derives from the trade of indigenous arts, indigenous-made objects, romanticized representations of the West. And at the same time, there's a growing national, international interest in contemporary indigenous art. And there are multiple artists from New Mexico who are rising stars and veritable stars in the arts internationally. So I'm curious about the role New Mexico can play, New Mexico's institutions, artists, professionals, academia, other stakeholders, in what appears to be a local and national attempt at reckoning with some of these legacies and championing some of these artists without exploiting them. Big question. Who wants to start?
Okay, there's definitely an acknowledgement that there's incredible, not just national but international interest in many of our artists in New Mexico and indigenous artists, and it's you can just also see the market sort of grab it, and when you talk about transactional, I mean it just is starting to happen at a pace for artists, many of which I think have in terms of their life and career and maturity as artists, have at a place where I think they can negotiate it. But it is something that I've observed in the last 2 years since I've been here, just given the number of artists that are curators, for example, to give you an example, coming here looking for something or wanting to meet a specific artist. And I think it's something that you don't know how long it's going to be in terms of a fascination. The one thing we all know about the quote-unquote art world is that it's very fickle. And it is driven very extensively around an incredibly complex international market. And so you can see an artist that might have been working in Albuquerque 2 years ago, struggling to sell work, now sort of negotiating, incredibly powerful galleries, important museum exhibitions abroad, and it's something that it's just a reality. It's not something that we can be critical. It's about it's there, it's happening. How do we negotiate it? How do we support the artists that are in that position? And it's going to continue for a while. I don't know how long it'll last, but it is it feels like a moment where everyone's paying attention.
We could have started here. I think we've gotten to the juicy part right now. So, Louis, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the word that came to mind was sustainability. Right? Sustainability for the arts, because, we all know that they're fads, and New Mexico has been a fad throughout history, and sometimes it's strong, sometimes it's a little weaker. Sometimes there's an economic component, sometimes not so much. I guess I'll just reflect on, from the perspective of being a member of one of those indigenous communities, if you are an indigenous artist, yes, go fly the world, you know, yes, go meet people, like make your people proud, be out there, but what you do at home is really where things live, and that's where it's sustainable, right? Is what happens when you are received by an elder, an auntie, what happens when there's a small child who's got, you know, bright eyes and they want to hear where you've been, and, you know, how do you play that? Because that's where all of the beautiful things grow, right? Is in that community, in that relationship. And so these other relationships, you know, I think what I'm afraid of, and I see sometimes, is that we've forgotten what a game it is. And I'm thinking of, I don't know if you guys know Rick Hill. He used to direct the Institute of American Indian Arts Museum. He's a great theorist, thinker, Native guys. Iroquois, and what is he? Seneca, Cayuga, Mohawk? Anyway, one of those. I remember him telling me a story. I was working for him as an intern at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Marie Watt was an intern with me. Now Marie is stratospheric in the arts world. But he said, listen, this is how it goes. He said, my dad taught this to me, Stan. He said, there's a, oh, this sounds kind of crass, so forgive me, but he said, there's a white man there, and he has money in his pocket. And my job is to get the money from his pocket into my pocket, and anything I say is fair game. You know, and it's just like, this is a game. This is a game, right? And so, but now that we've got more people who are in professional positions and who are, you know, reaching these other institutions that have been out of reach in the past, I'm afraid that we might forget it's still a game, right? I mean, it's gone from being a game to like a lifestyle. And I don't know that that's good or bad. Like, I don't want to judge that. But I know at the end of the day, I want those folks to be sustainable. And having watched this or been a part of it or studied this, I can think back through generations, and there's always a golden boy and a golden girl. And they come and then they go, and they're eaten up like fast food, you know? And I'm very protective of people. So I don't know what to think about that, and I actually don't have an answer to that right now, except it confuses me.
Well, it's also the generosity that you bring back, and I think I've seen that with artists who bring it back to their communities, who bring it back to their lives in a way that really is enriching. So it is a game, and you know, the art world is unfortunately very tied to transaction, and to fashion, and to lifestyle. It really started in my lifetime as a museum person really early in the 80s when you know, young artists were marketed like products, frankly. And frankly, that generation in the 80s, many of them really struggled for the rest of their lives. I'm not saying we should be sympathetic, they seem to be pretty comfortable, but it is a factor that really crept into the art world. Now, having said that, and when we think about colonialism, you know, the traditional philanthropy that, you know, that our parents' generation grew up with around museum culture was really rooted in colonialism. So it's not like it was better in the old days, but it's something that we have to deal with. I know every museum professional has to commit to doing things to sustain their organization. And I think where we as cultural workers can do or be active in is really support the artists, you know, and you've got to, you know, really make sure you protect them and create those relationships in a constructive way and support them. But it is an incredible phenomenon. But I guess on the flip side, what's so amazing is finally the recognition of great talent in places that curators were not looking.
But I'm not giving any brownie points. No. So I mean, the way I think about it is like they've had, what, 100+ years to pay attention. They're paying attention now. It reminds me of like when a dad picks up a kid at school. Oh, he picked up his child. You know, it's like, oh, you're paying attention now. You know, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be cheap about it, but you know, I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated at the moment, yeah.
I'm hesitant to answer this question just because I don't have much experience in the art market, but I will say that I did buy a piece at First Friday last week, and this is the first time where I was able to afford to buy something on the wall. And the crazy thing is, like, my instinct was not to like go and look for like the curator or anyone. I wanted to talk to the artist, like, hey, like, how can we do this, right? Again, like, I'm kind of thinking of, you know, that, I don't want to call it a transaction, but that interaction as also being relational, right? So I think about all the like beaded earrings I buy, and they're consistently from the same beaders, you know, because it's kind of like, again, creating this, I don't know, like a kinship almost, right? I don't know, that might be a little too much, but yeah, so I think I will say, after I bought the piece, they called me a collector, and I was just shocked. So I don't know what to do with this new identity of being an art collector, and I feel like this is a very New Mexico-based language.
You're going to get a lot of calls from galleries. You're on a mailing list.
I got really involved in what everybody was saying, so I don't know if I remember the original question very well. But yeah, I think for artists of color, or whatever terminology you like to use, and particularly Indigenous artists in a place like New Mexico, the transactional part certainly is super real. I think, you know, this moment right now is interesting because lots of people, I think, across the nation call it like we're having a racial reckoning, and we're thinking about our history, and we're facing these things, and which can be cool as people want to start to, like, you know, do more exhibits focusing on these things, and funders have money and different stuff. That can be cool for the opportunities, but I also think for a lot of artists there's skepticism around that. It can feel a little bit tokenizing. It can feel a little complicated about why you're being invited to the space, how you're being invited to the space, like all of those things. So again, I don't have an answer about good or bad about any of that. But certainly it's amazing to see amazing artists get their due. That's awesome. I think we're all invested in that. I just think it is complicated. It is hard to know how long it's going to last. And I think now I'm remembering the other thing that came to mind early on when you asked the question was just thinking about, like, again, from this museum perspective, about being willing to kind of interrogate the colonial structures that were built in the image of, and how those function, and how we can kind of start to, like, unravel them, which is really difficult to do. I mean, my museum's a division for the state of New Mexico. It's like very much like structure and hierarchy all the time. So I think that work is complicated, but also trying to do that in honoring the relationships with the artists that we work with, and moving together in this kind of interesting moment of a lot of people suddenly wanting to talk about things that a lot of people have been talking about for a really long time.
I certainly have more questions, but given the time, I think other folks have questions as well, so I'd like to open it up for a little Q&A. And JC's going to grab the other mic to pass it along. Does anyone have a question for this panel?
I can probably just project. I'm pretty loud. I'll use the mic.
Yeah, if you could use the mic, that helps us.
Hi, so I am not an artist. I don't consider myself part of the art world, really, but I consider myself pretty close. My little brother is an artist, and he's really wonderful. But he, as an artist, often pushes the boundaries of emotion, of reality, of society in his art. How, as artists and museum curators, have you seen the integration of that to making that palatable to markets, to people attending museums? What does that intersection look like? And is it changing as we go into these spaces of really looking into new places for art?
So you brought up a thought for me that's in this world in which we're dealing with like massive gun violence and environmental degradation and economic issues, you know, so much going on that the role of an artist, and I'm going to sound kind of corny here, but it's more important than ever because that is a free space and it should be a non-commercial space, right? So whatever emotions that your brother is putting into that work, whatever he's sharing, there are other people that need to hear that, right? Uncensored, right? They need to feel, because we've gotten ourselves in this kind of consumer commercial cycle where we're waiting for someone to tell us how to feel. We're waiting for someone to tell us how to think. And the arts, this is the fun place, right? This is where anything goes. So I hope that he holds on to that and keeps that wildness, whatever's happening there, because I think we all need it.
I'll also just point out just where we are and draw some attention back to this show. There's some really challenging work in the space right next to me here today. I echo everything Nancy just said. We need it. We need it a lot right now.
Do you have to use the microphone?
Yes, right here.
So I think of New Mexico always as being in the vanguard. And in part, I feel this is due to the ancient land that we live on. And by that I mean the land that first came above the water, like the Himalayas. This is an ancient land, and it carries a tremendous amount of power as a result of that, as a result of the volcano in the Jemez, which shook the earth when it went off, which spread ash 600 feet deep and boulders into Nebraska and Kansas. I mean, this is a powerful place. And then it also has the layers of indigeneity, of the dinosaurs, and the Anthropocene, which we have also, like a magnet, drawn to New Mexico through the bomb. I just think there's a lot of other layers of things that create power, spiritual energy, and other kinds of things that go on here, not to distract from any of the current things that we're talking about, but just to recognize the power of this place and why there's so much that is drawn to it, because it has this ancient history that's like really super ancient. And I don't really know how to put that in the context of the dialogue that we've been having, except to acknowledge that I always feel like New Mexico's in the vanguard. It doesn't matter if it's police violence, it doesn't matter if it's missing indigenous people. All of this kind of stuff has been a locus here. And I think it's really important to acknowledge all of the length of time that we're here, not just contemporary times, 150, 500, 700, 20,000 years. This is a really powerful place where we live, and I just think it's important to acknowledge that.
You bring up fascinating points. I mean, you know, we forget that there was a time in Los Alamos that changed the course of humanity. And so the power you're talking about is in my opinion, is a lot of the seduction and attraction to this place. And it seems to continue and manifest itself in different ways, but it is, there's no question that the great physical beauty of our places continues to lure people to New Mexico, and I think that'll continue in the layers of history. Actually, a really good way of understanding
Hi, so I've been thinking about local to global relationships between New Mexico and the rest of the world, and so I had a question just thinking about a couple of contexts. So with Site Santa Fe, I went to all 3 of the biennales that focused on arts of the Americas, and I feel like a lot of really interesting questions were being asked, and that was 2014, 2016, and 2018. And then Nancy, you've worked on those 2 decades of the exhibitions in Venice, and you brought artists that were based here over there. What do you all think has changed in terms of what's being communicated through exhibitions from New Mexico to the rest of the world, you know, whether those exhibitions are taking place here or overseas?
Well, I think we're seeing, you know, in the context of constructing a show that brings many different artists to a place. I mean, that was the intent of Site Santa Fe's mission initially in the idea started in 93 and then was realized by Bruce Ferguson's biennial in 1995. And, you know, the beauty of his methodology was that he did bring and drew themes out of place and context, but he also brought together 30 some odd artists, including several artists from New Mexico, into that dialogue, and it created a kind of synergy that I think still has value, you know, in terms of our communities, and I think it's something that's good for all of us in terms of, I mean, you always want to be in a place where ideas are coming from everywhere, and in a way we have a luxury of scale that people can interact through those experiences. So the biennials that I worked on as a director, not as a curator, were always messy, but frankly, it's when Site Santa Fe finally started to mature as an organization. In fact, the more contentious one that happened in 1999 was probably the first time I really felt that Site Santa Fe started to really address place in a significant way. So I think, and again, for good or bad reasons, I think it's just what's happening now, the world's starting to look at us again. And the nuances and the ebbs and flows of how that happens, we really can't control, but it is something that, you know, I feel was an important part of Site Santa Fe's reason to exist. Our team, we talk about this once in a while. I don't know if it resonates with my team, but I've always said that we should embrace the tension between the global and quote unquote the local. I wouldn't never call it local, but that's the phrase that comes up a lot. And Rockefeller Foundation in the 90s did a lot of research, and you know, they came up with a catchy phrase called "glocal," which was Tomas's way of, we have real presence here when he had an influence at the Rockefeller Foundation. It was really kind of wonderful, but it is something that I think all of us should embrace. You know, it's in terms of push it, pull it. You know, really, you know, let you know the artists that are living and working in New Mexico bounce off that, create it. I mean, it's something that's really I think it's important for, you know, places like Site Santa Fe to continue to be engaged with.
Thank you, Michelle, for the questions. Great to see you. Let's visit afterwards. So I did 20 years of exhibits in Venice, and our organization, the Native American Arts Alliance, had as our mission to allow Native artists the opportunity to exhibit on an international stage without market constraints. So we were anti-capitalistic, anti-institutional, and so often I don't know really how that changed anything, but I know that the individuals who went were transformed, and then they brought that back to their communities, and those communities were transformed. And so I was kind of less into how this shows in a magazine or arts career, although guess what? Jean Smith, who of course is like at the top of the game happening right now, she did an installation for our first exhibit in 1999. I don't think Jean is known for doing installation art. It was crazy. It was like clotheslines that move on a motor, and then there was an audio component. It was called Shot Heard Round the World. And during our opening, this was back in the day of the Walkman, someone stole the Walkman, and we just never had audio after that. So, I mean, do people know Jean did that? I don't know. I mean, that hasn't been my job to like put that out there, but maybe someone cares about that. But the global local, I mean, one thing that and I'm writing actively about the book, so I'm kind of like too far into the game to make sense now, but what we did was that we treated the local Venetian people, right, as our comrades. They are indigenous to the nation state of Italy. And so we were on their homelands, right? And so they're local. And without them, the Biennale doesn't happen. And no one really recognizes that. I mean, the people who live in Venice run this show. And they have opinions and attitudes, and they can make things happen or not really quickly. And so that's a whole nother dynamic that I don't know how much I'll be able to document, but I'm hoping to get some of that in the book.
I'm going to jump in on this question because I think about the local to global, or global, is that what it was? Global?
That's the 1990s.
Okay, well, that was a good decade. I think about this a lot, and for me, it's been about a little bit more like maybe subject matter related in exhibitions, and thinking about activism and some kind of social justice, and how we can think about our the relevance of like what's happening locally on a global scale, and then also what's happening globally, its relevance on a local scale. And I think we see that a lot of artists who use their work as a form of activism also are like expressing that kind of solidarity with things, and I think with things locally and globally at the same time. And that's just like I think a really productive conversation to have when we think about kind of like what we can do in our homes, but also how we're kind of connected in these bigger pictures. And then also the kind of back to the connectivity question, I think that's another way that we can do that, right? When we're putting artists who are, from New Mexico in exhibitions with artists from all over the world, like everybody gets to know each other, and we get to kind of build those networks in that way too. Thanks. Are there any more questions? One more, and then we'll come up here.
Hi. I'm curious if any of you have a specific vision of a dream art world and how it would function, if you would save what we have now or discard it entirely and start with something fresh. And then also another part of that is if there are any institutions or movements that you have in mind that are kind of working to achieve that vision.
What a good question.
That's a really good question, and I wish I had more time to think through it, right? But a dream world, I think would definitely be, I guess I think one of the issues, again, is like accessibility, right? Like who has access to materials, who has access to space to create. So I think a lot about co-ops, and I know that there are a lot of collectives that do that work, but how we can kind of collaborate and, again, kind of create and foster those physical spaces as well, not just, theoretical kind of art world, but a physical art world, and one which, like communities of color are present, and working class people, poor people, unsheltered people. Everyone should have, the right to be able to create. And I think right now, like, our current art world doesn't have that structure for all of our artists.
I flashed upon something, so I've been fortunate enough to be doing ceremony in 3 different locations. And the latest was my family in Mescalero. So if you come down south for the 4th, you know that we do the dances, and the girls are having the coming of age. And they're totally immersive, wonderful, like sensory experiences. And to see so many beautiful Native families smiling and enjoying themselves and laughing and being so engaged for days on end, that's like a dream world to me, you know? And it takes a lot of sacrifice to make those moments happen, but when they happen, they're pretty great, yeah. And it's art. I mean, it's dance, it's music, it's visual, it's everything. So I think our society is actually hungry for that, you know, really hungry for that.
I agree. I think people need, and I always like using the word experiential, because I think on many levels art sometimes diverts away from that and it loses that connection between the viewer and having that impact. So, I mean, I think it's part of the thinking about programming and empowering the artists to create those experiences for audiences. It's really important. And it is about that human connection. And that's why sometimes virtual gallery spaces and virtual experiences last for about 5 minutes and they dissipate, because you don't really connect. And I think that's what audiences really, really crave and need and want, at least I do. And I think that the word I like to use, experiential, that shows, I mean, you can walk through this exhibition and you can connect to work, and that's something that's critical. And I think especially museums need to pay attention to that.
I think this is, I wish I had more time to think this through too, but kind of related to what Marina is saying too. I think my dream art world would be that everybody can have the ability to make what they need to make, and that we could kind of exist in a way that understands the artist as like doing a fundamental service to who we are as communities, as society, as people, to the extent that we could maybe remove the market part and not make that have to be a requirement to sort of make those things sustainable. Maybe there's that. I think we have time.
Thank you. It's been really wonderful listening to all of you, and especially hearing about the whole broad global market and the whole broad, world of art and so on. But I've heard almost nothing. I haven't heard the word Hispanic once, and I haven't heard the word Latinx once, and therefore it feels like you've left out a whole section of the art world in New Mexico. And I wondered why, and if you could address that.
Hi, Helen. I think thank you for sharing that, because I definitely mentioned Hispanic and Latinx as part of the artists that I work with in a contemporary setting initially, but I don't know that I was getting into that cultural specificity as part of this conversation. So yes, not intentional, but I think I was speaking a little bit more generally, but thank you for pointing that out. Does anybody else want to?
I just, it's a good question, and I think again, it's like where the light is shining today, but I'm very proud that at Site Santa Fe, that's not an issue. We really are committed and continue to, and you'll see that in our programming. So, but the thing is, I think it is, again, this craziness of the market and how it just like focuses on, I mean, Latinx was something that was hotly discussed and addressed by several major foundations, and by the way, it was driven by artists. And I think that was a really good moment, especially for the Ford Foundation. And it sort of addressed something that was not happening in those power structures of the major foundations. And 516 benefited from that. So it's very much part of the dialogue. I mean, I can assure you that's maybe didn't come up here as much, but it really is part of an important and critical piece of the ecosystem of what we do. So.
It's literally my whole job, so sometimes I take it for granted that I'm not maybe saying the words enough, but yeah, thank you for bringing
And I know we could all talk at length on all of these questions and subjects. So unfortunately, we're out of time this evening. But thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for the people live streaming in. And very much thank you to the panelists for a wonderful conversation, to Suzanne and 516 for hosting us. I'm sure there will be more to come from all of us. And we also just created community. We all didn't know each other that well, and now we're all connected. And that's how it happens in small steps. So thanks for being here, and have a good evening. Thanks.